Chapter 13, Land Resources. The country has about 300 national parks. A lot of people don't really understand the difference between the different types of federal land uses, national parks versus national forests. And so part of what this chapter will be doing is talking about some of those different types of federal lands. Start off talking about some national parks, just a couple of examples. The Congaree Swamp in South Carolina, the largest swamp preservation in the United States. Started campaigning for it back in 1969. Became a monument, another different type of land designation, in 1976, and then finally became designated as a national park in 2003. The Great Sand Dunes National Park in Colorado contained the tallest sand dunes in North America. Again, started off as land that was purchased by a non-governmental organization, the Nature Conservancy, along with federal, state, and private donors, and then it also became a national park eventually in 2004. So again, it's another one of those little bits of information that's important for us to understand. As I mentioned, the average citizen doesn't typically really understand the different land ownerships in the United States. In general, if we look at all land across the United States, about 60% of it's owned by either private citizens, which would be us, land that maybe we or our family own, and then also land that's owned by corporations. So locally, we'd be looking at companies like Sierra Pacific, and then also the non-profit organizations like Nature Conservancy that we've already mentioned. So that's the bulk of our land in the U.S. About 2% is owned by Native American tribes, 9% by state and local governments, so state parks or county parks, state or county land in general, I guess. And then about 28% of it is federal land. And the interesting thing about the federal land ownership is over the decades since we've designated land as forests or national parks or monuments or wildlife refuges, the federal government has tried to incorporate all different types of ecosystems within the federal land ownership to preserve the diversity of ecosystems that we have in this country. Along with this, then, we've also been able to preserve all types of different resources. Resources that have historic value, things like national battlefields or cultural significance. Again, that could be battlefields, it could be different monuments that have been built since our country first started, or just some unique biological habitat, interesting, unique ecological features that we want to be able to see and for our children and their children to see. The vast majority, acreage-wise, of the federal land that's set aside is in Alaska and the 11 western states. You have to realize that when we first started settling this country, we started mostly from the East Coast. So by the late 1800s and early 1900s, when we started setting land specifically aside, much of the eastern United States had already been settled. So it's not that we don't have parks and monuments and forests back east of the Mississippi River, but the bulk of the acreage of the land was in the western states because they were the least settled at that time. So federal land is set aside in national parks, as we've already mentioned, preserves, wildlife refuges that are managed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, our national forests and grasslands that are managed by the U.S. Forest Service, wilderness areas that are within typically our national parks or our national forests, and marine sanctuaries, areas along the coastline of the United States that are set aside as preserves to benefit those aquatic species or marine mammals that need those areas for their habitat. So looking at the map, again, it kind of reinforces that you can see the bulk of the acreage of our federal lands are in the western United States and Alaska. Although, again, you can see a lot of examples of particularly national forests, refuges, and, of course, parks and preserves that are scattered across the eastern United States. Keep in mind some of the little dots may be even too small to really see on this scale of a map. Along with the different types of land that the federal government sets aside are the agencies that are actually established to manage those federal lands. And again, typically average citizens don't fully understand or know who these agencies are and what they do. So we're just going to touch on some of the main agencies, the ones that either have the most land that they manage or the ones who have a big role in taking care of federal land. So we have 4 primary agencies that we'll look at. 3 of them are under the Department of the Interior. So if you look at the hierarchy of the federal government, the agencies that run different parts of the government, there are 2 primary agencies, the Department of the Interior and the Department of Agriculture, that deal with land management. Forest Service is under the Department of Agriculture, and there's history behind that, basically moving it into the Department of Agriculture. At the time, the thought was that managing our forests is a little bit more like managing crops that we grow. So our forests were primarily thought of as being places to be able to grow trees so that we could harvest them and provide for the raw materials that our country needed. So we kind of looked at our forests a little bit more like long-term agriculture. And then we also have the Department of the Interior, which contains the BLM, the Fish and Wildlife Service, and our National Park Service, all of which manage large blocks of federal land. Table 13.1 lists the agency, the specific type of land that is managed by that agency, the primary uses, and the amount of acres that that agency manages. So you can see the BLM, Bureau of Land Management, is the federal agency that has the largest number of acres. It's always kind of been said that even though you can see the primary uses are mining, grazing, oil and natural gas extraction, as opposed to you looking at some of the other agencies where there's more things like watershed conservation, habitat, hunting, fishing, that kind of stuff. The BLM got a lot of land, but oftentimes it was the land that the other agencies didn't want. Not to say that it's useless by any stretch, but it's typically land where maybe there weren't trees that were suitable for growing for timber production, or maybe it wasn't the optimal wildlife habitat, or maybe it didn't have the best sort of cultural value or value to our preserving as heritage for humans like the Park Service did. So they got a lot of land, and a lot of it was, again, stuff that the other agencies didn't really want. Our Forest Service manages our national forests, and forests are managed for multiple use, meaning we do log for timber products, but they're also heavily used for recreation, just habitat for wildlife. There is mining and grazing, as well as oil and natural gas extraction that also occurs on our Forest Service land. But again, a wide variety of diverse uses. Fish and Wildlife Service manages our National Wildlife Refuge system. And as you might imagine, wildlife habitat is the primary function of our National Wildlife Refuge system. But along with that is also things like hunting and fishing. Parts of refuges may be off limits to hunting and fishing, or may be off limits at certain times of the year. But then there may also be a certain amount of hunting and fishing allowed, as well as other activities like mining, logging, livestock grazing, and extraction of natural resources. Compare that and the previous three examples, the BLM, Forest Service, and Fish and Wildlife Service, compare that to the National Park Service, where the main focus of our national parks is preservation and allowing for recreation. So we don't graze, we don't log, we don't take natural resources off our national parks. They're there for us to go and enjoy, so for recreational purposes, and just to maintain the environment in its natural condition as much as possible. So having the ability to preserve habitat for wildlife. So the Park Service actually has a pretty tough mission, because millions and millions of people visit our national parks every year, but yet we try to maintain them in as much as possible a state of naturalness. So you can imagine it's tough to keep areas looking natural when millions of people visit them every year. We talk about our parks being loved to death just because of the volume of people that visit some of the main national parks we have. So again, unlike the other areas, the park system is land that is preserved. It's set aside, it's not managed, generally speaking, and we don't allow resource use like extraction. Then we also have a variety of other agencies that manage the rest of our federal land. The Department of Defense, typically for the military bases, Army Corps of Engineers, which is also under the Department of the Army, but they manage water resources like Shasta Dam, for example, building the dam system, building locks, I should say, not managing it, but building the dam, building lock systems up and down the big rivers, those kinds of things. Agencies like the Bureau of Reclamation that actually manage water resources. The Bureau of Reclamation office in Redding is by Keswick Dam. And there are a bunch of others that are maybe of I won't say lesser importance, but maybe lesser known. Natural Resources Conservation Service, who doesn't really own land, but they do help landowners do a better job of taking care of their land. So make sure you know the main agencies and the type of land and the type of uses that they have for that land. So ultimately, all of these federal lands provide a lot of valuable services that benefit humans. Everything, again, from preserving wildlife habitat just to keep the environment intact and healthy and functional, to areas that were managed specifically to help flood control and minimize erosion, areas that are set aside specifically to get water back into our aquifers to recharge our groundwater. Keeping the whole environment healthy also then helps break down those pollutants that do get into the environment. And ultimately, especially land like wilderness and our national parks serve as what we call benchmarks to determine the impact of us on the planet. Areas like wilderness areas and national parks that aren't actively managed and generally speaking have pretty minimal human influences are sort of our reference point when we look at other land that we have dramatically affected. So we can look at the effect of our impacts on the geology of areas between, again, wilderness areas and areas that are used, but also from a zoology standpoint, the animals, the plants, from a general ecology perspective, from a soil science perspective, and provide an opportunity for education and science in these areas. In addition, we've already mentioned recreation value, but we're talking about the whole gamut of recreation, from hiking and swimming and fishing and boating to rafting to hunting to camping, and more than just a place to go have fun. Ultimately, these types of land offer us a place to go and relieve our stress, get away from the grind that we face at work. A place that if we didn't have it, we might be a lot more stressed out than we are. And again, as I mentioned, many of these lands are also developed for things like extracting minerals, grazing, logging, a lot of those different types of things as well. So keep in mind, there are most of our federal lands are intended for multiple uses. Some of those are passive and some of those are active, like logging, grazing, and extracting minerals. Of the ecosystems that encompass the United States, forests are really important ecosystems in general. Although they occupy less than about 1/4 of the dry land on the surface of the earth, over the human history they've been so important for timber production that allowed us to keep our homes warm, build our homes. Pretty much, if you go back in time, not that far really, everything we depended on was wood. And we got that directly from the tree that we had to cut down to build our home, or the trees we had to cut down to keep our home warm. So it was the ultimate construction material, and it still really is. But it was, in the past, pretty much the primary resource that we needed for everything. In addition to the obvious then, forests have also provided us with food, lots of different food items, not the trees themselves obviously, but things that are associated with forests. Not only the nuts and mushrooms and fruits that is listed here, but also the animals that are associated with the forest. But then also a lot of other products like medicines and different chemicals that we were able to identify and provide a lot of basic necessities now that that we all depend on to some degree. Just one example, the chemical that we get from the willow tree, basically the chemical that we now know as aspirin, salicylic acid. And so Native Americans have known for a long time that the willow bark had that benefit, and we still use aspirin today. But then also employment. There are millions of jobs within the federal government, specifically in the area of taking care of our natural resources. This is obviously what I teach. My natural resources program here at Shasta College focuses on getting students ready for the types of jobs that would be within the realm of the kinds of things we talk about in this class. And so there are just millions of jobs within the federal government taking care of our resources. But then there also are, again, recreation values, spiritual values, and all of those ecosystem services that we've already talked about throughout the semester so far. Certainly forests as an ecosystem have a very large role, not only in regulating climate, but also in contributing to the hydrologic cycle that we've already talked about. Forests themselves have the ability to capture and recycle rainwater back into the environment. Just being an obstacle on the ground to intercept rainfall, slow it down so that it can percolate into the soil and recharge the aquifer. Huge role that forests have just in, again, managing or buffering the hydrologic cycle to get that water, ultimately get that water into the groundwater by slowing it down and giving it time to percolate. One of the sort of contentious issues, I guess, with respect to our forests is the production of timber. Cutting trees down in order to provide for timber products does have the ability to alter natural conditions. Now, typically, when we manage an area for timber production, we're managing that area in such a way that we're trying to grow the forest back, replicating kind of what nature would have done. So, although again, going back 100 years when we clear cut thousands of acres at a time, that was not a good sustainable practice. There is still clear cutting that occurs today, but for example, as much as people don't like the way it looks, and I agree, an area where there's been a clear cut doesn't look pretty, but when a natural fire burns through and kills a group of trees, it doesn't look pretty anymore either. It's really not about how it looks, it's about getting that forest growing back. And so again, if we're cutting small patches, clear cuts, if you want to call it that, that are 5 acres or 10 acres, it's mimicking a natural fire that would have killed a group of trees, or a disease outbreak that would have killed a group of trees. And the whole reason there behind this type of management is that some trees need full sunlight to grow back, others don't. If we're trying to grow back native species of trees that need full sunlight, we've got to open up the forest. And so we are in reality not altering natural conditions typically the way we manage a forest. We're trying to mimic natural conditions. So again, this is always one of those things that we kind of fight, the way that the public perceives something, or that they don't like the way something looks. But really, timber management at this point is doing everything it can to match natural conditions. This is one area within this book, because this is my background, that I don't think the book is kind of doing a good job of giving a balanced perspective on both sides of this issue. Again, timber production, typically the way it's done today, doesn't really alter natural conditions. We're trying to mimic natural conditions, and we're trying to maintain the composition of trees and even get it back to the way it used to be with the way we manage our forests. Commercial varieties may be planted in many places in the world, but in the United States, we're using seeds typically from trees that are growing right on the place that we're trying to grow, that we're trying to harvest. So we'll go out and harvest seeds from a site and then grow them so that when we harvest that area, we have seedlings that we can put back so the genetics of that area are preserved. And again, there are monocultures that are created where we might replant one species and kind of focus on that one species. But there are lots of natural forests where there is only one species of tree growing, and that's the way that they naturally grow. And even when we plant one species in an area, say after a fire or after we harvest an area, there are lots of other species around, and the other species will find a way to grow back in that area. So more of these issues are being seen in other countries in the world that don't have the technology that we do in this country. Again, foresters, whether it's the Forest Service or whether it's a company like Sierra Pacific, foresters are managing the environments not strictly to grow trees to cut them down. They all have wildlife people, soil scientists, fisheries biologists, and they are making ecological decisions when they manage a forest to try and mimic nature, to get the forest back to the way it used to be. But there are certainly examples where in the past, for this country, and in other countries where they've created monocultures, really simplifying the environment by replacing the diversity of plants with one or two species of plants. But again, think about this. What do we do with agriculture? If we're going to grow corn in an ag field, we grow hundreds of acres of corn. We're sacrificing those acres to grow product that we need. And yet when we do that from a timber perspective, people get all annoyed. Well, again, it's really the same thing. And even if we're growing one species or few species of trees in an area, how long are those trees going to be growing there before we harvest them? Decades. How long is a field full of corn going to grow before we harvest it? Months. So even a more of a monoculture of a forest is going to be there a long time to provide stable habitat for species that do use it. Again, it's really the same thing, except it's the scale of time that's different. Agricultural crops use herbicides and pesticides just like we do a little bit when we're growing trees, at least maybe initially, but we only maybe spray those chemicals once or twice within maybe the first 5 or so years of that forest growing, and then we never spray again until maybe we harvest it and replant it in 50 or 60 years. Ag crops are sprayed multiple times every season. But again, people don't seem to complain about that with agriculture like they do with forests. So again, it's all about putting things in perspective. It's true, as the book says, that a monoculture can't support as diverse a group of organisms because there isn't the diversity of food items. But again, also keep in mind that not all forests are diverse. We have a lot of examples just around Northern California where a forest is dominated by one or maybe two species of trees. Our lodgepole pine forests up around Lassen Park are pretty much only lodgepole pine. They all grow up together. They live for a period of time. The fire will eventually come through and kill all of them. So that's like a giant clear cut. But those trees need that to grow back. They need full sunlight. They all grow back together. They actually need the fire to even reproduce. We have red fir forests all around Mount Shasta. They're primarily red fir. Occasionally there will be some other species in there as well. But they are a pretty uniform, natural forest type. So again, all I'm really saying here is just, keep an open perspective on this. And again, this is one chapter where I don't think the book really does a good job of covering both sides. So that's why you're listening to me talk. There are really very few, if any, examples in the United States where we don't practice some level of sustainable forestry. Again, we've known since the 60s and 70s how important it is to maintain a healthy ecosystem. So we use management practices that try to mimic nature to keep our forest ecosystems balanced. Again, where it's appropriate, we maintain a mix of trees that mimics nature. And again, in those types of mixed forests, we still might harvest them commercially while maintaining the biologic diversity and maintaining habitat for wildlife. And as well, again, protecting watersheds, reducing erosion, helping the hydrologic cycle. But again, not every healthy forest, not every natural forest contains a mix of trees. So just, again, keep that in mind. Managing our forests also maintains wildlife corridors. We do have, again, wilderness areas, national parks that are protected zones, basically where we don't log and we don't develop areas. So it provides unbroken habitat for species of wildlife that helps reduce the chance of extinction. especially for those species that need large blocks of area, animals like wolverines that need large blocks of habitat. But again, that doesn't even mean that a managed forest is totally worthless to animals. Just because we're harvesting trees in a forest doesn't mean that we're clear cutting the entire forest. So while we may be harvesting parts of a forest, there are other parts that are not being touched. And so we are still within our national forests and land that's owned by Sierra Pacific are still maintaining blocks of land that still provide valuable habitat to wildlife. Annually, we harvest about 120 million cubic feet of wood. Again, what does that number mean? Can you imagine? Can you envision what that is? I can't, but it's a lot. But keep in mind, worldwide, the vast majority of wood is still harvested to be burnt for fuel, to keep people warm. So that's about half of all wood that's harvested is burnt for fuel. And again, that's not typically as much in this country, although some of us do depend on wood for heating in the winter. We're talking mostly about the less developed countries. 3/4 of the remaining 50% in the more developed countries are used for all the paper products that we utilize, including cardboard and packaging, as well as all of the other wood products. Again, the obvious stuff are the 2x4s that you go and buy when you want to build something. But there are so many other forest products, chemicals and things that we depend on beyond just the actual wood. There are a variety of methods that we use when we're harvesting trees. Depending on how you want to look at it, these can actually be termed harvest methods, or they could actually be called reproduction methods, because really the way that we harvest trees in order to gather that wood product is also tied directly to how we want to grow the forest back. Again, if we're going to be trying to grow back the natural species, the native species that need shade, then we're going to do something like selective cutting, where we're going to selectively remove certain trees, and as image 1 on the bottom of this slide. So we're not completely exposing the forest floor, we're just opening up small areas, and this allows the understory species, the shade tolerant species, the native species that need shade to grow back, that provides the right kind of situation for those species to grow back. And again, natural regeneration is typically what we manage for. We manage the trees in such a way that they can reproduce naturally and grow back. Sort of an intermediate type of harvesting method is a shelter wood cutting, where we ultimately are removing the majority of the trees, but it's happening over a period of time. A clear cut is basically taking all of the trees at one time. A shelter wood is kind of a slow motion clear cut, if you will. We remove certain trees at first to open up the space, and that allows for the remaining mature trees to reproduce. You can see all the seedlings in the understory as well as the stumps in figure 2 that were left from the trees that were harvested. Once those understory trees start filling in, start growing back, then we may go back in later and harvest most of the rest of the mature trees. So it's kind of a multiple stage or a multiple process clear cut that again is done specifically for the purpose of growing a forest back with trees that need a little bit of protection to get started. So we're harvesting maybe the undesirable species. We're not necessarily taking the dead trees because we want to leave some dead trees behind as well. Again, the book says less desirable and dead trees. We're not going to take all of the less desirable species because again, we want to leave some of those behind for the diversity. We want to leave some of the dead trees behind to provide habitat, nest sites for birds, from animals, perching areas. But ultimately, again, we are going to harvest the trees kind of in multiple stages. Kind of a two-step clear cut is what we might call a seed tree method. So we're going to remove most of the trees. Again, not all of them. We'll leave some behind that are seed trees. They're the best of the trees out there. The species we want to maintain, the species that look the healthiest, that are resistant to disease, and then we'll harvest most of the rest of the trees. Those seed trees then are spaced out equally so they produce seed. The seed hits those open spots, and then that allows for the natural regeneration of those trees that are intolerant of shade, that need sunlight to reproduce. And then clear cutting, which is the method that usually gets the most attention, again, because people don't like the way it looks, or they don't think it's ecologically a good way to do things. So ultimately, this is a method where we cut all of the trees in an area. Now again, rules are different from state to state, but anyone have a thought on how big of a clear cut can happen in California? What's the biggest area that we can clear cut in California? It's actually about 20 or so acres. We can't cut, I think 30 is the absolute maximum size of a clear cut in California. But because of the public kind of not liking it, more than not being a good way to do it, most clear cuts are actually much smaller than that. In many cases, we have private companies around here that will not cut patches more than maybe 5 or 10 acres in size. Again, we do clear cutting because we are trying to manage for species that need full sunlight. And again, it is the most cost-effective way for a company to cut trees down. That's why we clear cut in the past completely. That's all we did, which is also why we got a bad balance in many areas. We got an imbalance in the species that we have now because of how we improperly managed land in the past. But for the last 50 plus years, we've been doing it in an ecologically sustainable fashion. So again, where we clear cut in patches, a couple, 5, 10, 20 acres, it's to grow back trees that need full sunlight. And basically that's the reason why we still do clear cutting, because that's what naturally is necessary for certain trees. Again, what does a clear cut like the image 4 represent in nature? A fire that went through and killed everything, a disease outbreak, an insect outbreak, knocked down by wind. Certain species of trees don't have very deep roots, so you might get a lot of snow in the winter that builds up on the trees, and then you get lots of wind that can blow the trees over. Now, before you think this, or maybe you already have, the main difference is that when we clear cut, we pretty much are removing the trees from the site, and if they die or are knocked over, they are still there. Now again, keep in mind, we don't just clear cut an area and then don't do anything to it. In other words, if we clear cut an area, we either go back in and immediately plant trees, or provide for the ability of the area to seed back in, and it doesn't stay naked like that very long. You've got trees and shrubs that start growing back immediately, grasses, those kinds of things. But typically today, when we clear cut areas, even small areas, we usually go right in there immediately afterwards, and we'll plant seedlings back in there. Plus, there's always going to be debris on the ground. It's never going to look clear like this image does. This image makes it look like every single thing is gone down to the bare soil, and that is never going to be the case in a real clear cut. You've still got litter and duff on the ground that are covering the soil. That helps minimize erosion. You're still going to have down dead trees that were there before we went in and clear cut that are going to be there to help keep the soil in place. So again, this image kind of over dramatizes how it's going to look after the fact. Again, it's going to be barren of maybe living, standing trees, but it's not going to be bare down to the bare soil. Because of the push for being sustainable, and again, even though I argue that most of these companies and the federal agencies are managing sustainably, there's been a push by the public to want to buy certified wood or green wood. And so there are third-party groups that basically certify a forest or the products coming from a forest as being certified. And if they meet that criteria, then they get a special stamp. And when you go to Home Depot to buy wood, you might see the sticker there by the wood that says Certified Sustainable Management or something like that. And again, there's certainly value in doing that, and most companies now have sought that because it makes the public feel good about buying wood that they know is grown based on sustainable practices. Keeping all that in mind, deforestation is still a problem worldwide. Again, not really in this country. We have more trees growing today than we did in the past. They're smaller on average. We don't have maybe as many of the really large trees that we did in the past. But it's really a problem that parts of the rest of the world face, whether it's clearing because of the products, or clearing for agriculture, or clearing land for other uses. Worldwide, forests have shrank by about 13 million hectares in roughly the last 10 or 15 years, every year. And most of this is occurring in Africa and South America. But even countries like Russia are being logged heavily. They don't grow really huge trees, but they are still being logged heavily in an unsustainable manner. And because of these large-scale deforestation efforts that are going on, we have all the problems that we talked about, the reason why we want to maintain our forests in a healthy state are being negatively impacted in other places in the world by, because of the deforestation, decreasing fertility, increasing erosion, causing sedimentation, driving the extinction of plant and animal species, losing the ability of water to kind of flow normally within that hydrologic cycle, and even having potentially a much greater impact in that large-scale deforestation can actually affect or increase the effects of climate change. Deforestation in the boreal forests, the conifer forests, is also still occurring and has been kind of more heavily occurring since the 1980s. Again, your book kind of points out Alaska, Canada, Scandinavia, Russia, like I just mentioned. It's not that we haven't been harvesting these areas prior to this, but again, it's kind of become more to the attention of the people. About 2.5 million acres annually logged in Canada. Again, they're arguing that it's being done unsustainably. The book is talking about how Alaska's forests are at high risk. The regulations up there are not as stringent as they are in California. Larger scale clear cuts are still allowable up there. So again, there's some truth to the fact that a lot of logging is going on. I mean, there is truth that a lot of logging is going on, but again, you're looking at large clear cuts with forest types where those trees basically need full sunlight to grow back. So somewhere in the middle probably is a better place to argue this challenge. Typically we focus on rainforests as being the biggest problem with respect to deforestation. Our tropical rainforests, if you think back to the chapter that talked about biomes, are areas that get a lot of rainfall, and because most of them occur in less developed countries, there's a lot of unrestricted deforestation going on. As those countries continue to grow, they need ways to stimulate their economy, so they're going to tap into their natural resources like their trees. Also just needing more space to grow agricultural crops for cities to develop. And so those areas are still very heavily impacted by unsustainable harvesting of trees. But also part of the problem is here in this country. There are still products that we depend on, or that we want, I should say, that come from these other countries. And the more that we have people fighting being able to harvest timber in states or countries like the United States, and states specifically like California, the more that we have lawsuits that stop us from harvesting timber in a sustainable fashion, which we do in California, the more that timber is going to have to come from somewhere else. Where else is it coming from? Well, other states to a degree, other countries like Canada and Russia, and the rainforests, which, as we just saw in the previous slide, in many cases are not being managed sustainably. So for every acre in California that we can't harvest, that we can't manage for sustainable timber production, we have to cut an acre of trees down somewhere else in the world. And to me, that is the biggest travesty of this whole issue, where people just fight logging and sue and do all these stupid things, is they don't understand anything about the big picture. We can manage and provide our timber needs in California, but we are a net importer of wood products in California. We have plenty of forests that we can manage sustainably to meet our needs, but yet we're meeting our needs by buying timber from other countries where they aren't sustainably managed. People don't want to see it in their backyard, but it's okay if it comes from somewhere else in the world where they don't have to see the unsustainable harvesting of timber. So again, it's really just about being educated and making educated decisions. Forestry is one of those things that's obviously my interest and my background, and it just bugs me when people say things that are totally uninformed, and it bothers me a little bit when people, groups, sue companies or sue the federal government to stop harvesting trees, but what's their home built out of? Do they use toilet paper? Do they have any other wood products in their home? The answer to all those things is, of course, yes. So where does that wood come from? Well, a lot of it's not coming from California, but it has to come from somewhere. Some of the other challenges are also in our tropical dry forests. And this can be even a bigger challenge because you got less precipitation, which means the trees might not be as healthy or as free of stress. But in these areas, the primary reason for cutting trees down is fuel, just for heating and cooking. Again, for those people to heat their homes and cook their food, as well as things like charcoal production that's very wasteful. When I was doing research in Mexico for my graduate project, the ranch down there would sell its mesquite, and there were groups of people that would come in. They would harvest the mesquite, chop it up, pile it in a certain way, and burn it down to charcoal. But again, in that process, there is quite a bit of waste of wood. And then, again, where does that charcoal go? It goes to more developed countries that want to use it on our grills. So that is also a wasteful use of wood products. So again, this figure just shows kind of the distribution of those tropical rainforests, those areas that are very prone to deforestation for all the reasons that we just talked about. It is true that in the United States, most of our temperate forests have been expanding, primarily because of good management, taking care of the land, also because of succession occurring in areas that were abandoned in the past. So trees are coming back naturally via succession. About half of our forests in the U.S. are privately owned. And of those, about 3/4 of them are in the Northeast and the Midwest. And there is pressure, you might say, to develop that land, typically for human developments like housing or businesses. But again, this figure just kind of shows the breakdown of forests. About 1/3 federal government, a little over 1/3 private individuals, about 18% corporations, about 9% state governments, and then a small little fraction that are owned by local governments. Again, county parks, for example. Our national forest system encompasses 155 national forests scattered around the United States that account for close to 200 million acres. Again, as I previously mentioned, these forests are used for multiple purposes. And one of the issues, aside from just cutting trees down, is road building. There was a big push a while ago to decommission logging roads. Roads can be a source of erosion. Again, if you've got bare soil exposed, it can erode, and then in a worst case scenario lead to mudslides. That soil can get into streams and create pollution. And although roads can fragment habitats, they also can create edge. And there are a lot of species of animals that benefit from having edges, habitats where two different habitats come together. Road building that created edge probably benefited a lot of species, as well as maybe not benefiting other species. So again, it's not necessarily all bad, it's just a mixed bag of benefiting some things and not benefiting other things. But the continued building of roads into forests is a challenge. We're required to use better technology now, sloping the roads in a way that minimizes erosion. When timber harvesting is being done, they are required by law in California to wet the roads down to keep the dust from becoming a problem, minimizing erosion, of course, those kinds of things. But the government's always looking at ways that we can decommission roads that are no longer used. But there's also the argument that some people have that it's just another ploy or another way that certain environmental groups are trying to find a way to stop logging. If you require that all of these logging roads be eliminated, then it makes it kind of hard to go in and harvest timber. So again, that's just another potential side of this issue. So on to another type of land, rangeland. Range is classified as areas that are typically dominated by species like grass and shrubs that aren't intensively managed for anything other than typically grazing livestock. We do manage our rangelands for wildlife, of course, as well, or land that may be valuable for mineral or energy extraction. Some rangelands have a lot of recreation value, as well as just preserving it for those ecosystem services. Again, range are typically dominated by grasses or by shrub species, but generally not trees, or if there are trees, they're sort of sparsely scattered across the landscape. if you happen to live anywhere around the Valley of California, the ring above the floor of the valley would be classified as rangeland, and yet, especially around Redding, that area is dominated by grasses in the understory and trees like interior live oak or blue oak. Those are very drought-tolerant trees, and so yes, there can be trees growing in rangeland. The reason grass is important, though, for rangeland is that, first of all, it has a fibrous root system which helps keep the soil in place. And then grass also is a food for grazing animals, typically grazing animals that we put there for ranching to grow food, basically, for us to eat. And so if we manage that land, we can still graze on it, we can still provide for wildlife habitat, and we can still use that land for other purposes. And as long as we carefully manage the grazing, we can actually stimulate new growth, keep the vegetation growing if we don't overgraze an area. And actually the hooves of the animals, which have replaced the native animals typically, still can mimic native animals by disturbing the soil just by walking on it. We call it hoof action, which can help get moisture in the soil. But it can also do the opposite effect. If you have too many cattle in an area for too long, they can actually compact the soil, which then doesn't allow water to get into the soil. So again, keep in mind that there are two sides to this issue as well. Just like proper forest management can be good for a forest, proper grazing can be good for rangelands, but improper grazing can be bad and can damage or affect some of the ability of the rangelands to provide us with those ecosystem services. Some of the problems that we face with rangeland are maintaining the carrying capacity of the land. In other words, as ranchers, we try to maximize the number of animals that we can feed on that native or artificial vegetation in a sustainable fashion. And so carrying capacity deals with the maximum numbers that we can sustain basically forever without damaging the environment. That is a number of animals. When we exceed the carrying capacity, we create a situation where too many animals consume too much of the vegetation and ultimately can destroy that vegetation to the point where it can't grow back, or where that natural vegetation disappears. It allows undesirable species to fill in. Plants that would never have been able to grow in an area now have an opening because the native plants are gone. And then that can also lead to other problems. Those invasive plants may not be valuable to wildlife or to cattle that want to graze that area. Or we can also create more erosion without that native vegetation being there, leading to permanent degradation of the site where maybe native and non-native plants can't even grow there. So ultimately, if we overutilize a piece of land, we as humans interrupt the processes that keep a land healthy, whether that's by overgrazing livestock or misusing the land in some way, we can create a very unproductive condition where we call an area being desertified. The process of desertification is progressively degrading the land to where we get to a condition that basically is unproductive. Ecologically, it's like having a desert. And again, there are examples of that occur in the United States as well as around the world. So we're always trying to manage to maintain the proper carrying capacity so that we can avoid overgrazing an area and ultimately degrading the land to the point where it no longer can produce any value to us or to the native animals or plants that would have used it. This is an example of desertification because of overgrazing, and then you have periods of drought, kind of like we're in now in California, and where then you have too many people as well trying to survive off of a marginal habitat. In this case, again, in extreme cases, you can have this desert-like appearance. Areas that were once covered with vegetation now down to bare soil. You've lost all of the topsoil, really don't have the ability to grow plants, to feed cattle. You see that the native trees pretty much are all dead in this area. So we've basically gone from once productive land to now non-productive desert because of overuse by humans. In the United States, about 30% of all land in the United States is classified as rangeland. Worldwide, it's actually, you'll see varying numbers, but worldwide it's about 60% of all dry land on the surface of the earth is classified as rangeland. So about 30% in the United States. A third of that is public land, 2/3 of it is private land, and most of that private land is used for grazing, for raising livestock. As we mentioned in the previous chapter, there are things like conservation easements that can help preserve rangeland, but also just properly managing it can conserve it and still have value for livestock and for wildlife. We definitely have improved the quality of our rangeland going back to the Dust Bowl in the 1930s, following, again, periods of drought, hot summers, the economic collapse that forced farmers to go bankrupt and leave their farms. Basically, the Franklin Roosevelt realized that we needed to make some changes, and we had the Taylor Grazing Act, which basically led to looking at managing our grazing land differently. Franklin Roosevelt created the Soil Conservation Service, which provided for scientists to help farmers and ranchers do a better job of taking care of their land. And so the decades following the Dust Bowl, leading up to the 70s, where we had the Federal Land Policy and Management Act, followed by the Public Rangelands Improvement Act, all ultimately were legislation that led us to do a better job of taking care of our rangeland. Because rangeland is already somewhat marginal, the rainfall is lower, typically not enough to support trees, but enough to support grasses and shrubs. The rangelands typically occur in areas oftentimes where you might have hotter, drier summers. And so they're already land that is, it can be very productive, but it can also be pretty marginal. And so if you're in areas where you are really marginal with respect to the quality or the health of the rangeland, even if you know what you're doing and you're doing everything right, it can take a long time to get rangeland healthy again if it's been really destroyed. And of course, it doesn't come cheap either. So again, that process can be slow and costly, but we have been doing a good job to improve conditions over the past 80 plus years. There are a variety of issues with rangeland management, just as there is with forest management. One of the more contentious issues, maybe the equivalent to clear cutting in range management, deals with the way that we provide permits for grazing federal land. Individuals, families have been allowed to pay a fairly cheap amount of money to be able to graze their animals on federal land. Generally speaking, the cost is much lower than if you were to try and rent one of your neighbor's pastures. A private landowner typically would charge a lot more, than the federal government does to graze. Permits can be held for decades by a family, which means that any given year there are permits that are renewed to families that aren't open to anybody. Which again, if it's federal land, there are a lot of people that think a permit that would allow somebody to graze their private animals on federal land should be open to the public for bidding, not be held just for a certain family. Conservation groups would even like to be able to get into the process. Maybe they could purchase those permits and then actually not graze at all, just use that land for to conserve it, to prevent overgrazing, to restore habitats. There are a lot of aspects of our daily life that is subsidized by the federal government. Some things people are aware of, others they aren't. The air industry, the airplane industry, is subsidized. Otherwise, it would be even more expensive than it is. Certain things like train travel are subsidized. Agricultural crops, milk, and a bunch of other agricultural crops are subsidized. So, in this case, grazing is subsidized as a way to still be able to provide the citizens of the United States with an affordable product. But again, there are lots of people, individuals and groups, that feel like these areas ought to be open to the public truly, not just a family that has a lifetime lease on it. On to our national parks and wilderness areas. Our National Park Service goes back to the 1916, but we've had national parks going back to the 1870s. Yellowstone was our first national park in 1872, I believe, but we didn't actually have an agency to manage our parks for another 40 plus years. Currently, we have 397 sites. The National Park Service doesn't just manage our national parks. They also manage other areas like monuments. They manage national recreation areas like Whiskeytown, if you're in the Redding area. The National Park Service also manages our battlefields. Most of them are back east. So National Historic Sites and a bunch of other types of areas. 58 of them are national parks that account for about 34 million hectares of land. As I mentioned earlier, the main purpose of our national park is to allow people to visit it. So a primary goal is to educate the public about our natural environments, the history of our natural resources, and just to have these lands set aside for people to enjoy. So that really is the agency that has a primary role of helping educate people. If you've ever gone to a national park, you've probably seen along trails where they have the interpretive signs for people to read. The visitor centers typically have displays for people to see and just, again, to understand our environment. The United States actually was the first country in the world to have the equivalent to a national park. We were the first country that set aside public land so that people could enjoy it in the future. And this has led eventually to 3,500 national parks in 100 countries around the world. But again, we were the first nation to do that. Prior to us doing this back in the 1800s, nobody ever thought there would be a reason or a purpose for doing this. As with our other public land, our parks and wilderness areas do have threats. I mentioned earlier that our national parks are always in danger of being loved to death. Basically, parks, the big ones, the ones that get a lot of visitors, Yosemite, Grand Canyon, Yellowstone, Back east, there are a bunch of them. They get so many people visiting them every summer, millions of people, that they are basically like cities. And not even small cities, but large cities. They have violent crime. They have to deal with vandalism, litter, traffic problems, air pollution issues, water pollution, degradation of resources. Because again, you have millions of people using areas over the course of maybe a few months, like in the case of the western parks that have snow the rest of the year. Unfortunately, as popular as our parks are, the amount of funding has decreased over the past few decades. And so some of the maintenance and some of the repair is going undone just because they don't have enough money. One of the challenges is fire. With all the fires and the fuels issues we've had, a lot of money gets directed to fighting fire every summer. And again, the federal government only has a certain amount of money. So when you have to decide who gets it, and protecting people and structures is a high priority from fire, a lot of money gets directed there and gets directed away from wildlife or other resources. And then unfortunately, our park rangers, the gun-toting law enforcement people, spend so much of their time enforcing laws, keeping people from cutting down trees or collecting things or creating vandalism, or again enforcing traffic violations, that they don't really have time to be educators, which was really the original purpose of a park ranger, was to be there to help people enjoy and appreciate and understand the environment. Plus, our being there, even though we're not actively managing these parks, our being there has created problems. Bears, for example, have dramatically increased populations because of, ultimately because they do a pretty good job of adapting to us being there. So the actual populations of bears have increased dramatically, especially in the western United States. And then you have problems with bears becoming acclimated to humans, getting into trash, breaking into cars, causing problems. Other species of animals, like elk and moose and other animals, have gotten out of balance as well, because people want to go to a park like Yellowstone and they want to see bison and elk and wolves, now that we've gotten gray wolves back in the Yellowstone ecosystem, to try and keep it in balance. But we've sort of been forced to create artificial situations in our national parks to a degree where we've allowed some animals to get out of balance because that's what people want. Wilderness areas are basically land that's protected with no human development being permitted. They're generally large blocks of land that don't have roads, that don't have permanent structures in them. And this was all because of the Wilderness Act in 1964. Now again, we've been setting aside parks since 1872. Why did it take so long to start setting aside wilderness areas? Well, again, ultimately, there's no good answer to that. But we did finally start setting aside wilderness areas, specifically in 1964. The only challenge was, by then, most of the eastern United States had already been populated and settled, so the vast majority of our wilderness areas are in the western United States, like our national forests. 757 areas, over 100 million acres. The biggest of those are in Alaska, as you would imagine. So again, these are areas that are set aside basically just to be completely natural. We don't manage them. We don't develop them in any way for any reason. We don't cut trees down. We don't develop it for mineral extraction. We may allow hunting in there, but we don't develop it, we don't manage it. As of 2009, we designated 52 new wilderness areas, adding about 2 million acres. There are groups like the Wilderness Coalition that are continually looking for new areas that we can set aside as wilderness. I guess most people, probably most scientists or natural resources managers, believe that land that is truly able to be called wilderness has already been set aside. Groups that are trying to set aside new areas of wilderness are, again, some of these groups believe they're just trying to do it to stop timber harvesting. So there are some areas within national forests that there are groups that are trying to get classified as wilderness areas. And again, whether it's truly because they believe we need more wilderness, or whether it's a way, another way to try and stop being able to harvest timber in certain areas, I'll leave that up to you guys to do some research on. But ultimately, there is more wilderness being set aside, and there may be additional acres of wilderness set aside in the future. But anytime we change classification from one type of land to another type of land, that ultimately means that we have to change how we use that land, or if we use the land. So it's always going to be a trade-off. Going back to the late 1800s, we had a variety of people arguing kind of two different perspectives on land management or lack thereof, kind of conservation versus preservation. And this ultimately led to the wise use movement that we still have today. The balancing multiple use management, in other words, again, using a piece of federal land for as many different things as it's suitable for, has led people to think that basically government overregulates the environment. There are beliefs that the primary purpose is to enhance economic growth, not preserve the environment. And basically that a lot of corporations are taking advantage of this and using the environment more for economics than for ecological reasons. So again, that still goes on today. There's been a lot of people arguing that some of the forest management acts that have been pushed or tried to be pushed into legislation, going back to George Bush as president, were just a way to encourage, landowners, companies, federal government, as a way to subsidize the forest industry. That Forest Management Act was largely about making our forests healthy again by going in and thinning them and then using those wood products for timber. Thinning them, in other words, to replace what fire would have done naturally to get our forests healthy again, compared to the way that many of them are now, where they're overgrown, thick with vegetation, and they're just not healthy because of the exclusion of fire. So the environmental groups said that all that was a ploy to allow timber harvesting, whereas the ecological side of the coin was, we can't burn our forests intentionally because of issues. And so how do we mimic natural fires? Well, one way to do that is to go in there and mechanically thin the forest to get it healthy again. So again, you got two sides of an argument there that we're still debating. The environmental movement going back to the 60s really put an emphasis on wanting to preserve our natural resources on federal land, because these lands are our legacy as citizens of the United States. But then we go back in history, and again, the reason that our federal government set aside some of our federal land was for a variety of reasons. Some of it, our national forests, were set aside to allow us to harvest timber, but then also later for all the other multiple uses. Our national parks were set aside as preservation, We're not going to manage them. Those are set aside strictly for the enjoyment of the people. Wilderness areas were set aside completely for no management. Let them be natural. So our federal government way back in the day set different types of land aside for different purposes, realizing that even though now we have a lot of other building products that aren't wood, wood is still the ultimate building product. Using metals that we dig out of the ground is more damaging to the environment and is not sustainable. Growing trees, harvesting them sustainably, and growing them back is the ultimate way to recycle, reuse, renew our natural resources. So again, it's that argument between, do we have enough land set aside? Could we set aside more land and not touch it at all? Should we? Could we? Two different questions. But again, these are debates that are going to take longer than we have here. So just comparing the wise use movement to the environmental movement. The wise use movement believes we should use all of our national forests for timber management. But again, that doesn't mean exclusively just cutting down trees without doing anything else. It means that we would allow mining development where it was suitable. I don't know that the third one here is true. I don't think there's any way anywhere in this country that we would ever allow unrestricted development of wetlands just because of all the environmental regulations. That really is not even possible, especially in California. The fourth bullet, selling parts of federal lands to private companies. I don't believe that will ever happen. But again, there are people, I guess, that believe that would be the case. And I would be completely against selling any of our federal land to private companies. Doesn't mean that I'd be against mining or forestry, timber harvesting. No, because again, those things can be done in a way that is suitable for the environment. But then we compare that to the environmental movement where those folks believe the primary purpose should be to just leave it alone and let it be natural. I don't disagree with the second bullet, that if we are allowing extraction of minerals, that those companies who do that ought to pay fair market value and shouldn't be subsidized. Again, I'm not sure how much or if all of the people who extract minerals are being subsidized or not. I wouldn't be surprised if there was some subsidy going on, but I also wouldn't be surprised if there was none. So that's something I would want to do more research on. And then certainly I don't think anybody would disagree with the third bullet, that people who use public land should be accountable for any damage they create. And again, I completely agree with that. But I also wonder if some of this is directed at timber harvesting. If environmental groups see clear cutting as damaging the environment, causing ecological damage, as opposed to the effects of a fire burning through causing the same type of impact on the environment. So like anything, there always are more, at least two sides to an argument. And this is one of those issues where people are pretty adamant about their argument on one side or the other. My only comment will always be, whichever side you tend to agree with or believe, research it. Look at both sides of an argument. Don't just believe what people tell you, whether it's environmental groups or whether it's the Forest Service. Don't just believe it. Research it and ask questions if you don't understand something. That's the only way that we can ever get at the truth when it comes to us having to make decisions. When we vote on laws or those kinds of things, we should be voting based on information that we've researched ourselves so that we think we're making the best decision that we can as citizens of this country. This slide deals with different groups that did a study that looked at endangered ecosystems in the United States. They used the following 4 criteria based on the area lost or degraded since we first colonized America, the number of examples of a particular ecosystem that are still here, an estimate of how likely a given ecosystem will be degraded over the next decade, and maybe as important as any of these, the number of threatened or endangered species that live in that ecosystem. And ultimately, the idea here would be that if we can identify these areas and rank them, then we look at the ones that are the most highly endangered, I put in quotes, and implement strategies to preserve those areas with respect to their biodiversity. So Table 13.2 lists the 15 most endangered ecosystems in priority. South Florida landscapes, largely because South Florida is becoming more and more settled by people. And then again, list down the line there. I would argue the California native grasslands are pretty important as well, since they are largely gone. Not sure how we're ever going to get those back on the scale that they used to exist in, because we've converted those areas mostly to agriculture or we've developed them for humans to live in. But again, those are the 15 most endangered ecosystems in the United States, based on that survey that was done. And again, there are several relevant to California. The California's native grasslands, the coastal communities, which we have a lot of in California, the Southern California coastal sage scrub communities, large streams and rivers, which of course California has a lot of cave systems, as well as our specific river and stream communities and the wetlands associated with those communities. This is another one of those figures that I don't know exactly what the authors of this book based this statistic on. They state that globally only 12% of the land of the planet is protected from human use or exploitation, which means 88% of the Earth's surface is unprotected. So again, how do you define unprotected? Are our national forests unprotected? Well, I think most environmental groups would put our national forests in the 88% of the surface that isn't protected. I would argue that what they mean is that we don't want logging to occur in our national forests. Our forests are protected from just anyone going in there and damaging them. They are managed, again, in a sustainable fashion. So my only concern about this statistic is that I really don't understand what criteria they used to come up with this number, and I would be highly dubious of this being a accurate statistic, because again, I have a feeling what they are calling protected land is that we're talking about basically wilderness areas or national parks around the world, and every other type of land would fit as unprotected, even though, again, all of our federal land is protected. It may not be protected from harvesting timber, but it's protected. So again, I think it's a matter of perspective here as to what different groups of people consider to be protected or unprotected. So again, just be aware that this statistic might be a little bit misleading in my mind. And then the chapter ends with a case study, the Tongass National Forest up in Alaska, and this area really being under fire for the debate over clear cutting. It's one of the world's few temperate rainforests along Alaska's southeastern coast. It's very productive for growing trees. Contains a lot of old growth forest, and also has been a prime logging area up until about 1997, when logging companies were apparently paid below the market price for timber. In 1999, the Land Management Plan of 1997 was modified that protected even more of this area, up to 100,000 acres of what was classified as old growth forest that couldn't be logged. In 2008, the forest plan for the Tongass was amended that replaced the previous plan and allowed for managing the land and resources based on current laws. So a lot of debate, a lot of legislation that has occurred over time that dealt with how we could use this vast resource. And we've mentioned the word old growth a couple of times, and I'm not sure if we actually get into that again anywhere in this book. So old growth forest is a term that has been defined probably as many different ways as there are people that have talked about it. A lot of people think of old growth as being a stand of big old trees, big, tall, large diameter trees that are really old. and that's what most of us envision. Old growth, though, I think from an ecological perspective, it's better to think of old growth as a healthy forest. Think about it from this perspective. If you have a stand of trees, a forest, and they're nothing but the biggest, oldest trees, do we need young trees to replace the old trees if that forest is going to be healthy and if it's going to keep growing? And hopefully you realize the answer is yes. So thinking of old growth as just old, mature trees is really not accurate. Old growth really is a forest that has all age categories of trees. It has the brand new little seeds that just sprouted. It has the young trees. It has the teenager trees. It has the mature trees that can produce seed. It has the old trees, and then it has the trees that are dying and the dead trees. All of those age categories are necessary for a forest to reproduce itself. Now again, as I mentioned earlier, there are forests that all die at the same time, and they all start growing at the same time, and they're all the same age until they die again. So could I have an old growth forest that is all age categories? Yes. Could I have an old growth forest that is all the same age? Yes. Could I have an old growth grassland? Yes. A grassland never grows trees, it only grows grasses. So I could have a mature, healthy grassland that could be considered old growth. Just like I could have a shrub community in California on the coast that's dominated by shrubs, but I could have an old growth shrubland. So old growth isn't about just big old trees. It's about a healthy forest that has whatever level of diversity that it should have. It makes no sense from an animal population to have nothing but really old animals, because what's going to happen if all the animals are closer to death? They don't reproduce once they hit a certain age. It'd be like saying the optimal human population would be all 80-year-old humans. We would be beyond reproductive age, and that wouldn't be sustainable or healthy. That's stretching it a little bit, but again, it's getting away from the idea that old growth forests are always just big old trees. They aren't. Forests that were here when we got here were not nothing but big old trees. They were a variety of age categories and species and different things. They were not just big old trees. So again, I just want to make it clear that you have to be a little careful when you think about what an old growth forest is. It's not just big old trees. We did not have, nothing but old growth forests, meaning big old trees in this country. We had forest ecosystems that contained all sorts of different species and age categories and big trees and young trees. So just kind of, again, keep that in mind.